So I just want to officially welcome everyone to our very first live discussion call for our Digital Identity Week. It's fantastic to have you all here, and I know David Nawazi and I are really excited for this first ever week that we hope will become a regular fixture on the DFI calendar if you find it interesting and useful. So as we are having more people joining the call, we will try and keep things nice and flowing during the next hour. We are only trying to take up 1 hour time each day, so there will be a live discussion every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday this week. And there is also plenty of time for discussion and chats as well in the DigiCampus, which is DFI's digital campus. So hopefully everyone has managed to also log in there as well and can start contributing and reading our background discussions there, and also contribute to the conversations online. As we have some new people as well as our old alumni joining us, I thought we could maybe just start with introductions between the 3 DFI team members who are pulling this together. So I'll start with my introductions as I'm talking, and then I'll hand over to both David and Nawazi as well. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Corley. I work at DFI, and my role is to convene the community of digital finance professionals and those interested also in financial inclusion. So it's my role to convene opportunities such as this, such as our webinars and our community of practices as well, which meet across 20 different countries across Africa and Asia. David, I'll hand over to you next to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. And hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. So I think I've had the chance to meet a number of you on courses, including the Digital Identity course, which is one of DFI's courses that I'm involved in teaching. So a pleasure to be with you all this morning or today.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Nolwazi Hlophe. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names. So I've seen you in some of our courses. With DFI as a regulatory lead, so mainly involved in a lot of our regulatory courses. And if you've been on campus, you've seen me in the video on the ID system of Eswatini, and we'll be talking a bit more about our case study today. So looking forward to all of the discussions. Thank you. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Nawazi. It's really amazing to see so many of you joining us. We have over 200 people signed up for our first Digital Identity Week. So I expect the number of people on this call is going to go up over time. So we'll just do a couple of housekeeping things before we launch into our live discussions. So we would like everyone to keep themselves on mute when they're not talking so that they don't disturb anyone else. We definitely want your contributions, so you can either make those contributions by raising your hand, and then one of us, either myself, David, or Nawazi, will come to you and mention you by name for you to ask your question. Or alternatively, you can pop your question and thoughts in the chat box as well, which David Nawazi and I will be monitoring. That helps us keep streamlined on the call so that we can keep to the hour and make the most of everyone's ears, comments and questions through the session. So that would be wonderful if you can just keep yourself on mute and use the hand up button, or also the chat box. We are also recording the session today as well. So should your internet connection fail, or for any of your colleagues that maybe couldn't make today's session, we'll be sharing the recording with you all, either via email for everyone that's signed up, but also it'll be posted in campus to give you that chance to catch up on anything that you may have missed or something you want to see. You're very welcome to put on your videos. We always love seeing people's faces. If you don't have enough bandwidth, however, you're very welcome to also just keep your camera off through the session. That's completely up to you. So I think without further ado, I'm just going to start very quickly by giving you just a little insight about DFI and DFI's community before I hand over to David, who's going to talk you through some of the really key, interesting highlights in the digital identity field. So I'm going to share my screen briefly with you all. And I do, everyone can see the screen. There we go. So just a little bit briefly about DFI's community before we start. You are one of approximately 12,000 people who interact with DFI on a regular basis. We have around 3,000 members on our league on LinkedIn called the League of Digital Finance Professionals. So if you're not in that league, then have a go on LinkedIn and find us. And I will happily accept your membership to join that group. We have some great discussions there. As I said, we have a community of practice with 20 countries with around 3,000 professionals attending those meetings. We have around 5,000 people who are viewing our webinars over the last year and a half, around 7,000 in WhatsApp and Facebook groups. And we also have, although not people, we have over 1,000 resources on our knowledge bank. So our community is growing, and we're really grateful to see you all online with us today, and also for your active participation and being part of our community. We're really excited about what we are able to do together, such as holding events like this, working together on the Eswatini live case study, which we'll be telling you a little bit more on this call. Just to have a little look at identity, digital identity community specifically, since 2018, we've trained over 500 students on our course in locations all over the world. 67% of our students were from sub-Saharan Africa and 33% elsewhere. We have a nice gender split of roughly 55 male and 45 female in terms of percentages of students, and from different sectors as well. So 20% from the development sector, 30% from public, which is sort of governments, and 50% from the private commercial sector. So it's great to see such a variety of people going on our courses. And I know that some of you online are actually from our courses now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to put together a poll, which I'd love for you to answer. So here with our poll, just to know a little bit more about who you are and where you've done a course with the Digital Frontiers Institute on Digital ID. So I'm about to launch the first poll of today's call, just to figure out what our community online right now looks like. How many of you have just completed our course, previously completed, so previously earlier this year or in previous years, or never taken our course? There's no right or wrong answer to this poll, no points to be scored, just really interested to see who we've got on the call with us at the moment. So I'll give you another 10 seconds to place your poll vote. We've got 43 of you online and 25 of you have voted. Give you a few more seconds. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's end the polling there. And I'm going to share the results with you. So here we go. The majority of you, amazingly on the call, 57% have never taken the digital identity course. So welcome to our digital newbies, to our community. That's fantastic to have so many of you, 17 of you never taken the course before. We hope that we're going to provide you with some really interesting information, and potentially as well that it might intrigue you enough to sign up for our course online too. And then we have 30% of you previously taken the course, and 13% of you just finished the course with us last week. I've seen a lot of you celebrating with your new certificates on LinkedIn, so that's been fabulous to see all the success. Super interesting to see the dynamics. I've got another poll to share with you now as well. I just want to find a little bit more about who you are. So I'm just going to share that poll with you now. The second poll is to find out what is your interest in digital identity. So let's have a go at launching our second poll. And we are now wanting to find out what kind of role you're in. So what is it that you're interested in and working in? Are you working directly in the digital identity field? Are you wishing to use digital identity in products or services you're hoping to deliver? Or are you just generally interested in the topic? Give you a couple more seconds to vote. Give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There we go, ending the polling and sharing the results with you. So actually, this one is really interesting. It's much more even split between those of you working directly in the digital identity field, those wishing to use digital identity in products and services, and those just generally interested in digital ID. So we've got a lovely mix on the line, which means we're going to have some really interesting debates and discussions over the next hour that we're together. I'm going to stop sharing the polls or results. Now we have an idea of who's on the call with us. And I'm going to hand over to our first presenter and speaker of today's session. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Sarah. And I hope that my screen is visible to all of you now. So, Sarah, as you've said, it's a great delight as DFI to host this first Digital Identity Week, because as I think most of you know, our hope is that we can be partners with you all on a journey of professional capacity building. And a journey is never a one-off course. And especially in this field, a one-off course really doesn't help, because the information, the knowledge depreciates extremely quickly. Those of you who've done the course in the past may be interested to know that it now has something like 40 or so videos. And this year, in fact, we refreshed the course, as we do every couple of years with all our courses. And I think we replaced as many as 13 videos this year, just after 2 years of running of the digital identity course, which is an indication of how fast information is changing and evolving. And so today, my hope is to give you a quick tour of the landscape, thinking about some of the developments which have happened over the last year or so, year and a bit, which at least for those of you who've done the course previously would be a kind of update. For those of you who've done it more recently, which is the minority, small number, you would have seen some of these things referred to in the refreshed course. And for those of you who've never done it, well, I hope this is a useful tour of some of the things that are going on, and maybe even an encouragement to say it's worth thinking about joining us in the next cohort when we run the course. But regardless of where you start from, let me just take 20 minutes as a quick tour of what's been going on as we start the conversation this week and we dive in more detail into some of the areas. Well, of course, this year, the centerpiece has been the story about COVID. And if it's done one thing, it's put front and center the issue of digitization, and a key part of digitization, this issue of digital identity. Some of you may have read this article, a leader in The Economist magazine just 2 months ago, where it had this headline saying it strengthens the case for digital ID cards. Now, my hope is that those of you who read The Economist would have read further, and you would have seen in that same article some of these things. Creating a digital ID system is hard and expensive. Well, why I'm emphasizing this is because part of the aim of our courses is to support you in joining the conversation. So when you read an article like that, you would say, yeah, I can remember some of the examples of how it can be hard and expensive. It goes on, The Economist, to say, yet India, a gigantic and largely poor country, has managed it. They can be introduced gradually, building on pre-existing platforms. Again, our hope is that you would say, yes, I remember learning about Adar, and maybe I've followed it, and we'll talk about it this morning to see what has been done in contexts like India and other countries. We'll discuss an update again this morning. And then finally, the point that might be most striking, they don't have to be compulsory, digital ID schemes. If they're safe and reduce the hassle of dealing with the state, people will willingly sign up for them. So those of you who've done the course, you would know the language of push and pull. Push, where people are forced to adopt an identity, required to by a government in order to access services. Pull, the case where they choose to, they want to. And we've seen that many of the best schemes, in fact, are some balance between that. And some of the most effective can be pull schemes, where people do feel safe and they feel that the transaction costs are low and there's a good reason to use them. So all of that just to frame what I'd like to focus on briefly in these 20 minutes, some updates, some discussion about ID ecosystems, some mention of some of the backlash, the reaction to some of what's going on, and then some updates on what's happening in the realm of financial standard setting, and in particular, open source. So very quickly, first of all, you all know that there are many drivers behind this push to get identity rolled out widely in the world. It's driven from a security perspective in some countries. It's driven from an economic development perspective in others, but it's also driven by the Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, which is about providing legal identity for all as a modern right of inclusive citizenship. Now, if you track where that's at, looking at the SDG tracker, which is a great website for tracking all the SDGs, but this particular goal is measured by that indicator, which is about universal birth registration by 2030. And on the map there, you can see the darker the color, the higher the proportion of universal birth registration. The map is noticeable because certainly Africa and parts of South Asia remain either light or even unshaded. Unshaded means no data, gray. So there's still a ways to go. But why this is important is because you would already know this if you've done the course, but so much of identity is about layering. It's about clustering and bringing together sets of attributes. And birth registration is often one of the most fundamental. So we talk a lot about different forms of public identity schemes. We talk about ways to consider how successful they are in terms of the proportions of people enrolled, in terms of the number of use cases that they offer, in terms of their cost even. But it's worth staying up to date with other outcome measures. So we talk about Adar, the Indian Foundational Identity Scheme, which is not a national identity scheme, as you would know. And I commend to you the State of Adar report, which is a large-scale survey done annually of Indians to find out how, in fact, they're using Adar and what their experience has been. So it really is a measure of the outcome of having an Adar identity. Now, DFI, in fact, Sarah ran a very useful webinar recently with the authors of this report. So if you want more, you can dive into it. The key headlines are there, though. The first is Adar really has contributed towards inclusion, people who never had an ID before. But it does also show that Adar wasn't the first ID in India, not by a long way. There are other identity schemes. And so Adar came in with particular features which made it compelling and useful. And that's what you see in those next bits of data. Half of people use Adar to access services, government services, for the very first time. So this is where identity goes beyond simply being a token or a credential to where it's actually used for something, where people find value in it. And as you would know in the course, we really do stress the need for use cases when we talk about identity. And then finally, that number there, that 80% of people, and that's a lot of people in India, of beneficiaries of government schemes, feel that it's made the programs more reliable by eliminating certain inefficiencies or frictions, as well as wastage, which has gone on in those schemes. So these are high grades. You don't often see these sorts of things coming out around public identity schemes, and I hope we'll see a lot more in the future. The reason we need to see that is because not all schemes work as well as this. So one of the schemes we talk about in the course, the UK's gov.uk Verify ID scheme, in fact, is effectively over. The UK government has ended funding for it as the example of rather an innovative brokered type of scheme that relied on private identity providers, no single unique central database, but rather a federation of identity providers. But it just hasn't worked very well. Not many people have used it. And so the UK, in fact, has ended that scheme, and which we talk about in the course. But of course, it's not all about bad news. We talk about Estonia, and that small country in Northern Europe, which is recognized for having one of the most effective government systems, not so much just for the digital ID part, but for the ways in which it enables people with a secure form of identity to access a broad range of services in a privacy-enhancing way. And so Estonia continues on that course. It continues with its innovative offering of digital citizenship to people who are not Estonian citizens. You can become an e-resident of Estonia, and as you can see, 70,000 people around the world have applied to do that, as the first example, certainly that I'm aware of a country offering digital identity as a service for people who are not in that country, but who wish to benefit from some of the aspects of being in the country, setting up a business, for example. More generally in Europe, we have to recognize one of the things that Europe has done well is not only in the digital sphere, having lots of research and reviews and policy and strategy, but also going back and reviewing its legislation and as a result of that, updating it. So the eIDAS laws, which define the standards under which public forms of identity have to be accepted across European states, that law was introduced 3 or 4 years ago. And recently, this year, was an impact assessment of that law. And you can read that impact assessment, a thoughtful way of saying, well, what happened? Did it happen as we planned? And one of the things Europe is now thinking about doing is going much wider than simply the public identity schemes into broader forms of digital identity under a much broader umbrella of accelerated digitization. So there's a lot going on in the public space. In fact, in many places, it looks like a mad rush to digitize and to create digital ID. Just as one example of that, the African Union this year published their digital transformation strategy, in which contains this picture of a house with foundational pillars, you can see there, enabling environments, digital infrastructure, and so on. And in the African Union house, that's where they put digital identity. It's there as a cross-cutting theme in this vision for a digitally transformed continent. Other visions would put digital identity as a pillar, something that's foundational. And I must say, the more I work in the space, the more I tend to think that getting this right, and by this, I don't mean a single scheme, I mean the whole ecosystem of schemes really is a foundation for an inclusive and prosperous digital economy. However, the mad rush that we see in some places by governments to implement digital ID has led to pushback, to civil society in a number of places pushing back. And the one example which we talk about in the course, and on which there was again a recent DFI webinar that you can listen to and get a lot more color around this, is the pushback in Kenya around the introduction of Kenya's unique identity scheme, Haduma number, which was rolled out last year, but then came to a screeching halt when a range of civil rights groups sued the government of Kenya, saying that there were a whole series of problems with the ways in which people were enrolled, leading to exclusion, as well as problems with data protection, which meant that the scheme could lead to violate the rights that Kenyan citizens have to privacy. So the Kenyan High Court, when they heard this, said, well, we don't agree with all of that, but we require at least that there be satisfactory data protection that takes place around the rollout of this. And in fact, that's what's recently happened just last week, announcements around new regulations which have been issued in Kenya, so that the second wave of Haduma registrations that started last year and then were stopped can now take place. And so, as I said, if you want to follow what's going on there in Kenya as a really interesting story of civil society engaging with government through the courts, raising questions of what do these rights mean in the context of an ID scheme, listen to that webinar, which was posted early in October on the DFI website. So I've used this word ecosystem several times already. And really, this is a picture of what I mean by that, drawn from a very good report that came out last year from Caribou Digital that we discuss in the course. The picture here is about Kenya's identity ecosystem. And what you see in the picture are a whole lot of different bodies, including government agencies. So that circle there covers Kenya's national ID, which is issued by a government agency, and even the Haduma number, which you may not be able to see on this size print, is in that cluster of identities issued by official agencies. But the point about this picture is that it has a whole lot of non-official agencies as well. It has civil society groups, and the different arrows and dots and things joining them represent all the different relationships which there are to forms of identity. Different people rely on identity. Some provide identity, some influence it. So that's the reason why this looks a bit like a spider's web. And the point of this spider's web or this ecosystem is to say, while government has an important role in standards, in creating foundational forms of identity, private sector's role is equally important often in the economic sphere. And so in the case of Kenya, that second circle you can see relates to the use of essentially SIM identities, mobile phone related identities, which are widely used in Kenya for mobile money and mobile transactions, which increasingly dominate forms of economic life in parts of the Kenyan economy. Those don't come from the government, those come from mobile phone providers. And that's something we'll be talking about later this week with the GSMA, which has a broader initiative around the provision of mobile identity. So it's important to think about any individual scheme in the broader context of all the relationships, the parties who rely on it, who use it, who may object to it even, when thinking about how an identity, and particularly a digital identity, functions in an economy. That's where it's been significant that this year now, for the first time, FATF, the international standard setting body in areas of financial integrity, anti-money laundering and combating terrorist finance, FATF published guidance on digital identity for the first time this year, after releasing a draft last year. So in that guidance, which you can access, they do a lot of description. That's often what guidance is about, making people familiar with what's going on. It is guidance, which means it's not binding on any FATF member countries. It's also technology neutral because they say their job is not to endorse a particular type of digital identity or particular protocols or standards. Rather, it's to understand what are the appropriate ways financial regulators should be thinking about digital identity, particularly for individuals. And we must stress that because I think the big frontier for identity is increasingly becoming that for legal entities and indeed for things in the Internet of Things. But nonetheless, FATF's focus is on individuals. And so what this guidance does is it really starts to reset the balance a bit about how regulators should be thinking about FATF's recommendations. So for example, in the past, FATF would say that when you set up a banking relationship with a customer, doing that in a non-face-to-face way, doing it through remote account opening, would be an example of a potentially higher risk situation. It never said it was higher risk, but it kind of drew attention to be aware that it could be. But what FATF's guidance now does is to reset that, to say that when you do non-face-to-face identification as part of onboarding new customers, part of CDD processes, those that rely on adequate levels of assurance may in fact be standard risk. In other words, as good as some of the face-to-face processes that rely on paper documents. And in fact, FATF goes further, which is to say, if the levels of assurance can be increased, or the controls, the countervailing controls increased, then in fact, using a digital form of identity, even for remote enrollment, could be even better than standard risk. And therefore something which could be widely encouraged and adopted. Now, what FATF does, though, is it puts a lot of burden on individual countries. And that's why we're very happy this week. We'll be talking shortly about the case study of an individual country, which is, as we speak, working through the issues of how to go about setting standards or adopting and rolling out digital identity. Just before we get there, last couple of thoughts. When we get back to thinking about this year, we can't avoid thinking about the COVID effect and what that's done on digitization. Just want to flag, here's another use case for digital identity. It's to replace that. I don't know how many of you have a document that looks like that, a little yellow piece of paper. That's mine, issued by the CDC here in the country I live, that's the US, but under World Health Organization standards. And in that little document, it carries little stamps from my healthcare provider about the different vaccinations that I've had. But of course, we know that like so many paper documents, there are problems. It's easy to lose that. It's easy to fake that. It's hard to scale up the issuance of those documents when you have to do it in a hurry. And of course, it's not very privacy enhancing, which is why I've blacked out my address there. on the screen. Why does somebody who needs to know whether I've had a vaccination also need to know my address? That doesn't seem very relevant. That's why, of course, there's a lot of discussion now about digital immunity certificates. How can we take what happened in paper before and make it digital? And if you're interested in reading about this topic, you can read papers like this, issued by ID 2020, that's the CEO of ID 2020, Dakota Grenner, about immunity certificates. There are a whole lot of processes which are being suggested about how you could download an immunity certificate into your secure mobile wallet. Of course, assumes you have a smartphone. It would require the medical facility where you go for the testing for immunity or to get a vaccination, for that case, to take a picture, take your phone number, and ensure that when the results come out, they are issued to that phone number and signed so that they can't be tampered with and changed by anyone in the future. The idea would be that then instead of presenting that little piece of paper when you need to do that, you could present your phone. You could open that wallet and show an image which might have your picture on it, or even better, perhaps, a form of QR code or some form of barcode that could be automatically scanned or go automatically a particular color, which would enable people to know what's going on. Now, the point behind that, and this is really the point I want to make, is that in order to do that on a global scale is really challenging. If you think about that piece of paper, that's issued by a national health authority, CDC, under a WHO standard for those things. If we want a digital equivalent of that, well, we have to look at what it means to issue a verifiable credential, which is a broader category than immunity certificates. We talk on the course about issuing credentials for having completed courses like DFI courses. And there are now standards emerging for that. The World Wide Web Consortium has issued a protocol for that. They are looking at using decentralized identifiers to look up to make sure who's signing this document. What's the public key used? Is it credible? Is it coming from a credible source for the purpose of this credential? And of course, what's missing today still is a way in which the standards are set for understanding what sits in those wallets so that they can be used across borders. So there's a lot of work to be done still, but it's happening now in an accelerated format to get to the outcome that replaces that little yellow piece of paper that we've had before. So that's in line with a big development that's happening across digital identity today, which is the push for open source forms of digital identity built on open standards often. You're going to hear tomorrow about MOSIP, which is one open source initiative run out of the International Institute of Information Technology in India, which is now offering open source forms of national identity in different countries. And I won't take further from the people you'll hear from tomorrow directly from the IIIT on tomorrow's webinar during this week. Here's another one to watch, though, that you might not have heard of. If you've been on the course, you would have heard of the OpenID protocol, which is run by the OpenID Foundation with a lot of big tech type of companies behind that. Well, they've got together with the IIF, the Institute for International Finance, which represents a lot of large financial institutions, the world's biggest banks, insurance companies, and so on. And they've got together in the context of COVID to say, we need to do something better here as financial institutions to leverage what we already have, which is they believe some form of trust, some form of understanding already of identification and verification of their customers. And we want to create a vibrant marketplace for digital trust services, which could leverage that further. So watch the space. Watch the space around the Open Digital Trust Initiative, because they say they'll be publishing standards in the last quarter of this year, which we're in now, technical standards coming out next year, but with the IIF lobbying financial regulators in particular about financially issued forms of digital identity having sufficient assurance. So finally, The issue of decentralized identity is something we look at in the course. In other words, identity in which decentralized ledgers are used rather than centralized databases, which are still by far the most common model today of issuance and verification of identity. The Decentralized Identity Foundation, DIF, was started last year as a place in which standard setting takes place, research, consultation. And I wanted just to bring your attention to this working group, the Banking and Finance Special Interest Group, which, as you can see on the screen, met last month, just a few weeks ago. And look at this, it says the group aims to be inclusive to a wide range of expertise and experience and is relevant to product managers, regulators, and so on. So, question to you all, if you are interested in the space, if you are working in the space, maybe this is a chance for you to participate in shaping the world of decentralized identity in the future. We hope you will, because part of this journey and part of DFI's mission is to equip you to engage well in this fast expanding, fast evolving world of digital identity.